Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show formerly known as the Daily Collective, brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we once again apply the practical philosophy of objectivism to everything. In this case, we usually talk about current events. So we're going to be applying objectivist principles to a few stories that have made headlines lately. There's going to be three in total today. The first one is about the Labor Party, which is supposedly looking to the Democratic Party in the United States for its policy issues and for its techniques for moving forward with their policy. So they seem to be moving forward in lockstep together. Now, it's not like this isn't traditional. America and the Brits have oftentimes moved together with respect to policy. We've been partners in crime for centuries. But this does seem to be an interesting shift where the Labor Party itself is getting in bed with the Democratic Party and figuring out how to promote their mutual agendas. The second story we're going to be talking about is the women's football team. I like to say soccer. I'm in America. So the soccer team, well, they got knocked out of the World Cup. They got knocked out early, and people are very happy about it for a number of reasons. The main one being they just thought they were a little too arrogant. They thought they were a little bit too cocky and they needed to be taken down a peg or two. And there's some people who are a little bit upset because of their social justice stances lately. So we'll be unpacking that a little bit. And there's a little topic potentially that we might get to towards the end. Not sure yet, but Spanish restaurants are banning lone diners. That would take me out of the mix. I like to go to restaurants alone. I know comedians make fun of that, but there may be a reason for that. It may be good. It may be bad. We're going to figure this out from an objectivist point of view. Now, the collective is going to grow as we're talking, but for the moment, it's me and Michael Liebowitz. But we're a collective in our own right. I think we can handle these topics. What's up, Michael? How you doing?
I'm doing absolutely wonderful. And it just occurred to me that George Thorogood would not be welcome in that restaurant.
Absolutely true.
I hope someone got it other than you. If not,
yeah. Come on, people. You know what we're talking about. So what do you think about this Labor Party now getting together with the Democratic Party and figuring out the best possible way to not only package their agenda, but incrementally impose it on their populations? I'm a little bit troubled by this development. What say you?
Well, the thing that stood out for me is that it's mostly tactical. Right. It's not they're trying to learn strategy. Like Biden recommends that they don't make it too ideological, which, of course, it is ideological. So it's about marketing and packaging and how to roll the thing out. But at base, what it is, it's about an increase in government intervention in the economy. They've taken from COVID. I don't know how they took this lesson, but the lesson they got from COVID was that government intervention in the economy works. And, we've done it over here, and evidently in Britain, they're going to ramp it up a little bit. I mean, to be fair, both countries have been intervening in the economy all along. And the idea that, they said the Labor Party had moved towards free market principles. I doubt that. I think that's part of the game they play, where they can claim it's a free market, and then when their interventions fail, they blame capitalism. The main takeaway that I took from this, though, is that the ghost of Lord Keynes simply will not be exercised. It's just intervention in the economy. That's the way we got to go if we want to grow the economy. And it's also why I think that knowledge of economics is vital in making the case for a free society. I think that the primary argument for a free society, as Ayn Rand said, is that it's the system that promotes individual rights or protects individual rights. That's absolutely true. That doesn't negate the need, though, to make economic arguments. And Keynesianism is bad economics. It can be defeated, but only if people understand the economics involved.
Yeah, there was a lot of manipulative language in the Guardian article, and scary too. You just alluded to one of them that said what the Labor Party took from the pandemic was that government intervention works. Now that's a frightening thing. So I think their concept of work and our concept of work are two totally different things. Their concept of work is that it enabled the government to centralize more power, to create more fear, and incentivize us giving up more of our moral agency, which they enjoyed. And so for a period of time, they enjoyed it. And it had that effect, the sort of ancillary effect of dropping CO2 emissions, right? They liked the fact that there was much less productivity, much less human activity, and that brought the CO2 levels down for them to, I don't know, pre-1980 levels. I don't know, it was some crazy stat like that. And so they like that. But even more disturbing to me was the equation of the Tony Blair-Clinton alliance with the third way economics. Now, anybody out there who knows a little something about economics knows that the third way, or maybe you could correct me, Michael, if I'm wrong, but I always remember that being associated with fascism. Fascism was third way economics. And I feel like that was a subtle way of asserting or conflating the idea that fascism and capitalism are the same. This is a trend that I've been seeing lately on social media that's very disturbing to me. Did you catch that, or is it just me?
I didn't, and I'm, to be honest, unfamiliar with the calling fascism the third way. When I heard the third way, I thought mixed economy. But that said, there's a long history of people co-opting words and using them differently. I mean, look at the term humanitarian, for instance, who even knows what it means, or democratic, even, for that matter. So I don't know. But you just said something that I found very interesting, because when I'm hearing worked, I'm thinking, and probably my fault, that they mean works for the people, that the people actually benefit from this stuff. I didn't think of it in terms of worked for the power structure and enables them to increase the power that they impose on everybody's lives. That's an interesting take, and you're probably right.
I'm thinking that the Guardian is looking at it that way. They want people to interpret it that way, of course, but I think the political establishment benefited from a COVID policy. And that's what they're really looking forward to, at least according to Klaus Schwab, right? This is the Great Reset. This is the time where they're going to take our property from us and we're going to be happy about it. I mean, I know it's become sort of
is that a great reset, though? I mean, they've been doing that for a long time. That's part of the problem I have with this idea that all of a sudden government's going to increase. People like in America, I'm sure you've heard it. They say, "Oh, we're losing our liberties." What do you think? This is a sudden phenomenon? I mean, before the ink was dry on the Constitution, Hamilton was pushing for an unconstitutional bank. This is nothing new, but people seem to think it is. One thing that I found interesting it's ancillarily related to the topic is this. On the left, they seem very committed to policy. They're trying to institute their ideology, get their policies passed, increase the size of government, implement Keynesian economics, probably with a goal towards socialism. While on the right, they're busy, in America anyway, fighting over trans issues and who gets to use what pronoun and what beer companies sponsoring whom. And that's just the type, and maybe the stolen election, but nobody in America seems to be actually fighting for principles, except for the left. I mean, there's nobody fighting for capitalism, for constitutionalism, for liberty. The right has just been co-opted by populists, cultural populists at that.
Absolutely. And I think this is why the left is winning. And this is where objectivists are unique. We understand that the left comes at every problem from sort of a meta narrative. They understand the overall necessity of making moral arguments, which they do. And the right gets caught up in the pragmatic stuff, the culture wars, the moment to moment problems, and then attempting to justify their perspective as practical. While at the same time lending moral credence to the other side, not a way to win an argument.
No, not at all. And the idea that it's practical, I've been hearing about this my whole life, that you have to vote for the lesser of two evils. That's the practical way. But what has that gotten anybody? I mean, are we any freer? Are our markets freer? Is our Constitution intact? I'd say no. So I don't know what the benefit of that is.
I mean, once again, Rand was correct in really pointing out how dangerous it is to morally compromise. You can't compromise with somebody who's on the other side of the moral track. You really can't. All you can compromise is your own integrity and your own values. And once you've done that, it's just a matter of time before they're entirely compromised. And as you said, we've been going through this for a long time. This Great Reset, which acts as if it's a sudden phenomenon, has been happening for over 100 years. But to me, it sort of reminds me of water going down in a bathtub. It goes down very slowly at first and then very quickly towards the end. And it feels like that's what's happening. Once it reaches a tipping point at which there is probably no return and things just sort of fall into place, right? And it feels like, well, this happened very suddenly when it's been going on for 125 years. Or at least the foundations have been laid for this very thing for the last 125 years. So I find this union between the Labor Party and the Democratic Party a little scary, because they're packaging. They understand how important packaging is and rolling out things incrementally so that people get used to it. Once they get used to it, you push the boundaries a little bit further. Morgan, what say you? We're talking about the Labor Party walking in lockstep now with the Democrats in America, and in an attempt to pass sort of the Green New Deal over on the citizens of the UK. What say you with respect to this issue?
Well, I find the Labour Party's desire to in any way compare themselves to the Democrats a bit strange, because in the Labour Party's own view, they are kind of like, the hardcore, like true socialists. They're the working man's party. And I suppose that the Democrats might view themselves as the working man's party in a way, but I don't think officially they in any way would describe themselves as socialists, would they? I think probably the kind of far left of the Democrats might think of themselves that way, but the kind of party official would probably want to steer away from a label like that.
But wouldn't you say the far left dictates the terms? Wouldn't you say those people who are more consistent, the AOCs of the world, the Squad, the Bernie Sanders of the world, are effectively pushing the moral argument in their direction? They're moving the right in the left direction, and they're moving the left further left.
I think there's a meaningful sense in which that's true. And the Labour Party was trying to do a little bit of this when Jeremy Corbyn was in power, because at that time it was in power. He was leader of the party, because the leader, or the potential leader for the Democrats could have been Bernie Sanders, it seemed at that time. And obviously they have much more in common in terms of their political affiliations and the kind of degree of their left-wingness, shall we say, than Joe Biden and Keir Starmer do. However, what was interesting with the Labour Party is, whilst I agree with what you're saying, Mark, that the people who are more consistent and, in a sense, more true to their own principles, in the long term, kind of drive the culture. Keir Starmer was a backlash against the more fundamentalist kind of socialism that Jeremy Corbyn was promoting. And as petty as it was, people in the UK rejected Jeremy Corbyn because basically he wasn't patriotic and conservative enough. He didn't do up his tie during a service with the Queen. He wouldn't sing "God Save the Queen," and so on and so forth.
I guess they let the anti-Semitism slide.
Yeah,
it was a tie issue.
Well, exactly. Although there was backlash against that, there wasn't nearly enough as there should have been for a real issue like that. Whereas, if you don't say God save the Queen, then, God, you really are. You could never run the country in that case. And so then it's only natural in a way that the Labour Party should be looking at Biden, who is, by comparison to Sanders, the compromise candidate, the one who is in a certain sense less radical than someone like AOC, even if he is in a certain sense making concessions and overall pushing them more that way. So there's a certain sense in which it's natural, and there's a certain sense in which it seems to me this is kind of a bit strange and a bit weird. But they're both a rotten bunch, and down to them all.
So for you, it's almost much ado about nothing. Our left-wing politics aren't anywhere near as left as your left-wing politics, and you don't see any time in the foreseeable future when there's going to be a union between the two. I mean, fundamentally, they agree.
So it might come across that I'm in two minds about this and not totally final in my opinion. So I completely get what you're saying, but British and American political parties don't seem to me to fully map onto each other. The Conservative Party in the UK don't actually seem to be a natural pairing with the Republican Party, really. And the Labour Party doesn't quite seem to match onto the Democrats. Now, there's an obvious sense in which the Democrats and Labour are the left-wing party, and the Conservatives and the Republicans are the right-wing party. But I sometimes find it's a comparison which we can test to the limits easily in drawing a comparison with them. However, since the Democrats are far more successful than Labour have ever been, it's natural for Labour to want to look to them as a successful left-wing option, because the last time that Labour was in power was 13 years ago now, and they left office in disgrace.
As far as I'm concerned, they're still in disgrace. But Meghann, what say you on this topic? Have you been able to catch some of the fundamentals? I know you've.
I haven't. I'm really sorry. I did read the article, or at least I skimmed it. I'm locked out of my Airbnb, so that's why it probably explains a lot of my connectivity issues. So bear with me here. You guys have been so patient with me. There is one thing, and I apologize if you guys already canvassed it, because so yes, interrupt me if you have. There was a quotation from the article. I'm sorry, I'm trying to pull up my screenshot here. That I found. I'm not sure I want to preface it, actually. I'll just read it. Okay, so here's the paragraph. Quote: back in the UK, Commonwealth has hired an American researcher, Melanie Bressler, to explore what the US Inflation Reduction Act might mean for the UK. She said, internal quotation, "The experience of the pandemic has been that really robust intervention can work." End of quotation. So what I would like is for the audience to super chat what on earth she's referring to, that the intervention that actually worked. So hit us up, because I have no idea what she's on about.
Yes, Michael and I discussed that quotation at length. You're doing acrobatics there. I don't know what's going on with your screen, but it's very interesting. We discussed this quotation at length. We came to some conclusions. Morgan, do you have any sense of what that quotation may imply? Because I found it frightening. I think Michael was a little frightened by it as well. Meghann, I'm glad you were, because we have very different ideas of what worked means with respect to the pandemic situation.
Yeah, I could only really conclude from it that there are some people who thought the lockdowns genuinely did a good thing. And I find a lot of this in the public discussion about the lockdowns after the fact, because I don't know what it's like in the US, but there's a lot of kind of public anger about the consequences of the lockdowns, that people couldn't attend funerals and things like that. And then there was a kind of ongoing scandal that it turned out that the people in government were having parties the whole time, and they weren't abiding by the rules that they'd put onto everyone else. So while some people couldn't go to funerals or had to sit apart from each other at funerals, as is the kind of common example, Boris Johnson and a lot of these other people were kind of, pally and having drinks and not abiding by the rules they'd set for themselves.
But didn't they punish him for that? Didn't they punish him for that?
So they have them in the sense that it kind of trashed his reputation. I think it'd be very hard. He seems to want to kind of, in the long term, do a Churchill and kind of revive his political career. I think that would be very, very difficult to do.
Okay, but Morgan, at least you punish your politicians for that. Our politicians go to the French Laundry restaurant and then have national aspirations afterwards. So sure. Gavin Newsom is one of the most brazen hypocrites on the planet.
Sure. But so whilst the public understands like there's something really wrong about that and Boris Johnson shouldn't be let off lightly, they're still on the premise that because the lockdowns were kind of sacrificing for the common good, there was we can never actually challenge that premise and say, Boris Johnson was doing a bad thing because he broke the rules that he himself set. Not Boris Johnson did a bad thing by setting these rules in the first place and then breaking them. So, I mean, and the most, appalling example during the lockdown was that the NHS is obviously a lot of the way that most people receive their healthcare in the UK. And the message coming from the government was, please don't use it to save the system. So, you should sacrifice your own well-being for the sake of the welfare, the healthcare system, rather than it saving you. And people can never, because of that kind of altruistic, communitarian kind of premise, they can never really challenge that lockdowns were a bad thing, even if they kind of almost get halfway there. So I can only assume that kind of quote is coming from someone who has to rationalize in their mind that these were a good thing, these did something, and something like that, or she's just talking a load of rubbish.
Altruism is always the dirty little birdie behind these horrible things. Michael, did you want to say something? Do you want to add to any of this? I noticed your mic is on.
No, it's on.
Okay. I meant on. Well, guys, to me, I'm a little bit more freaked out by this than Morgan. Morgan, you seem to be the leveling voice here. I think this doesn't bode well for the United States. I'm hoping to the non-existent God that the Democrats don't get in again. They're certainly angling for it by all extra constitutional means necessary. And if they get in and Labor Party gets in, I think we're in a little bit of trouble. So, but this just remains to be seen. It's a prediction. I'll put it in the hat and see what happens in the next couple of years. Well, our next topic, folks, is the U.S. women's soccer team. I guess they lost. I don't know anything about soccer, Morgan. So you're probably gonna have to help us out, Michael. You may know something about soccer. It's not my sport. I'm an MMA guy, and maybe American football, but not this other stuff. Apparently they had a winning record. Apparently they were quite formidable, and then they lost in the early rounds of the World Cup. And lots of people are really, really happy about that, mainly because they thought they were cocky and arrogant and they needed to be knocked off their pedestal. And then there's some other reasons down the line because of their woke positions on things. The fact that they kneeled during the national anthem and wouldn't sing the national anthem, they got a whole subset of other people upset. But let's talk about this concept of arrogance and cockiness first. What do you think of that? Is it a bad thing to be cocky? Is it a bad thing to be arrogant? Michael, what do you think?
I kind of go back and forth on this because I really think it's a good thing. When someone's good at something and they say they're good at it, I like that. I don't like false humility. Like nothing irks me more than when someone wins a great award or something. They come out and say, I'm humbled by this. Why would you be humbled by winning? That doesn't make any sense. But at the same time, I don't think it's a nice thing to do to try to rub it in people's faces, right? There's a difference between saying I'm good and me saying, ha, I beat you, you suck. So I could go kind of either way on that. But I think that the sort of level of the schadenfreude that's out there, I'm so happy they lost. Like, I don't care. But I think as an aside, I think we put far too much emphasis on sports anyway. Like people seem to live their lives through what athletes do. And I think that's absurd. I know it's not, it's not in the topic, but it's how I feel about the subject.
But that's an interesting diversion but it seems like sports is the one place where objective reality still matters.
Although I don't understand the vitriol, right? Like rivalry, I guess, but the idea that you'd be glad that these incredible athletes didn't win, I don't know what to make of that. So in grad school we played intramural soccer and football. None of us were any good. We were there were a couple of athletes. I was not one of them. It was just for fun to get out of the lab for a hot second. I could never do what the worst teammate on the worst team could do. They're incredible. I don't understand kind of wanting to trash them. Maybe for their politics, but because they lost, I don't know what to make of that.
Morgan, what say you? Soccer is a really tribal phenomenon out there. Here it's football, baseball. I've seen people get in fights, because the Yankees and the Dodgers, fans get in fights over their teams. So it's highly tribal out here. But what say you? What about this arrogance, this cockiness? What do you think of these as values? And should we have them, or should we discourage them?
So this is where I confess to being a very bad British person in that I don't follow football or soccer, and I don't drink. So I like coffee and rugby. But
we are scandalized.
But as for this example, I know a little bit about the US women's team actually, but I guess I lost interest once not Misha Tate, was it? What was the name? The famous women's captain in the 90s who was really cool. Anyway, forgotten her name. Lost interest once she left. But regarding this, I agree with you, Meghann, that the bit that stuck out to me was the kind of glee that people had around kind of like putting these people down. And maybe, maybe they were a bit obnoxious in their political opinions, but this is one of the areas where I think Rand really helps you think things through, in that, at least as far as I remember what she said, and I think if she did say that, she'd be right. The way people use the term arrogant is a kind of a package deal of kind of two things that don't really belong together. And it kind of puts together kind of what you were talking about, Michael, people who are kind of self-confident, who are really proud that they've accomplished something. And it puts together like the asshole who like wants to rub things in people's faces, or who's speaking beyond their knowledge or something like that. And that's what kind of arrogance can mean, both of these things at once. And it's not really fair to put them together. Whether it's justified, the degree to which people were kind of gleeful about it does signal to me that there was something a bit deeper going on. So kind of the tribalism that you were talking about, Mark. Football tribalism in the UK, kind of, it's not usually in this form. I remember being a kid and it was like, oh, there's been a riot, because between two football teams because this person scored this goal, or Suarez bit someone's ear, and it, that always seemed really strange to me, and I never really got it. But this kind of tribalism is kind of pushing out into politics, and this has kind of been affecting soccer broadly for the past few years. And it's often been around these kind of contentious political issues, kind of gender or race. So people really have resented it when football players have taken the knee around kind of Black Lives Matter and things like that. So if the US women's soccer team has been taking stances around trans issues, which I think is what they were talking about, I can imagine people would really resent them. And I would need kind of to look exactly what they've been speaking about to know whether they kind of have been obnoxious, but there's something that seems off to me in the degree to which people dislike them. And I don't think it's right to criticize them for being cocky, depending on exactly what they were doing. If they were being obnoxious, then almost by definition, that sucks and people should stop. But otherwise, I don't think people should put them down.
I wanted to ask, particularly you, Morgan, and the audience more broadly, about this idea of American cockiness, because the first time I traveled to Europe, I was 16, and I was told in no uncertain terms that they, Native Europeans can tell you're American just by the way you walk, by the way you hold yourself, and they often find it off-putting. That being said, I've traveled a lot since, and almost universally, my experiences have been incredibly positive. So is that the case? Can you tell I'm an American just by looking at me, or like I could walk around if you really want me to? And if so, is that off-putting? I'd like to see a poll in the super chat, to be honest.
Yeah. So I would say, and it's to Britain's shame and to Europe's shame more broadly, that there's a real anti-Americanism. Now, I think it's not as bad in the UK as it is elsewhere in Europe. If anyone saw Nikos's talk at this past year's Ocon, he sort of spoke about Greek anti-Americanism, and it's never been anything like that in the UK. But growing up, there was definitely a kind of anti-American spirit. And so, like any good 21st century man, I don't just have my one career here at the Ayn Rand Centre UK. I also work in the hospitality industry because you've got to get busy living instead of dying. And so working in hotels, I would say that a lot of my colleagues, who are pretty much all European, they do have a kind of anti-American kind of reaction. Now, I really like the American guest, and that's not just kind of from an objectivist kind of point of view that American values are kind of beneficial, although there's some of that. American guests broadly are very friendly. I've got some American family, and I always remember being struck that they almost seemed like fake happy all the time. Now, as I got older, I realized it wasn't that they were fake happy, that just I think Americans are a bit more expressive and assertive and kind of positive generally. Americans are also fantastic tippers when they travel, so that's always really nice. But there is a kind of anti-Americanism in the air, and whether that's feeding into this, I can imagine it is. I didn't take it when I read about this issue that it was because it was the US women's team, but it could be that. It's one of these things that works kind of insidiously in all kinds of areas. It was one of the things that I think was behind a lot of the dislike of Meghan Markle, for example, even though there are lots of other things going on there. In many ways, she was kind of too American of a woman to be accepted by the British public, and that was what caused a lot of the dislike. So I think you're hitting on something there, Meghann, that's true.
Well, American exceptionalism, I think, is the fact that we were the only society to legalize and build itself around the concept of individual rights. And there's something about that, the fact that we were all freeholders, the fact that we were all independent, we're sovereign beings before really anybody else really was. That gives a body a sense of optimism and benevolence and pride that the rest of the world cannot relate to. And the fact that, the rest of the world wants to take the piss out of us because we carry ourselves as if we're actually happy. How strange. The rest of the world looks at our optimism with cynicism. They think it means that there's something wrong with us as opposed to something right. And so, and I see this hatred of the women's soccer team as sort of reflecting a broader cultural movement that hates success and happiness and joy and goodness and really seeks to bust it down. And you see it in this vitriolic movement to kill all billionaires, to eat the rich, this egalitarian movement that's growing in popularity in the youth to try to knock everybody down to the same level. So, I'm going to hop on this bandwagon too and say, yeah, cockiness and arrogance, it is a package deal oftentimes where healthy pride and optimism and joy are lumped into these negativist, Trump-esque, let's say, ways of doing things. You have to understand, Trump ain't cocky and arrogant. He's not prideful. He's extremely insecure. Everything he does comes from the fact that he's a small human being inside. Pretending to be big. And that's why he has so much bluster. But these folks actually backed it up. When Muhammad Ali bragged, he had a right to brag because he did float like a butterfly, and he did sting like a bee, and he did slay monsters in the ring. And he did it at a time when nobody thought he could. And he should be justifiably proud of it. And that's the reason he's one of the greatest heroes in American history, and why I would have been starstruck to be around him, because that guy had it. So, but I do think that the political stance of the soccer team is something that needs to be addressed. I mean, the captain, the star of the soccer team, I can't remember her name now, but she came out for trans female athletes playing in soccer. Now, this has been, I don't know if this puzzles Europeans as much as it puzzles, as much as it's been an issue for America, but we really do have an issue attempting to figure out whether a biological male should be on a biological female team. And she's standing for that. Now, apparently at a time when she's going to retire and it's not really going to affect her, but this is sort of an act of self-harm in the interests of standing up for a quote unquote oppressed community. It seems like more altruism is at play here. What say you to that, Michael?
Well, there's also the kneeling. I think that's a big part of this too.
Mm-hmm.
It's the kneeling during the anthem. But as far as the trans thing, I tend to think that the risk of biological males taking over women's sports is really overblown. Now, I know people can name specific instances, but the very fact that people can name specific instances tells me that there's probably very few. I read somewhere, but I think it's called Spencer's Law. The more you hear about something, the less of it you have, because the fact that there's so little of it makes it stand out. So I don't know how much of a problem it is. I also have a slightly different take on the whole trans thing with as far as competing with men or men competing with women. It's this: if we would get the government out of athletics altogether, whether it be at the high school level, the elementary level, college level, whatever, then it would be a matter of private individuals agreeing to it. So I would be able to agree, I don't want to play with these people, you don't want to play, whatever. The problem is the government gets involved with sanctioning this stuff, and then it becomes a issue for the state to resolve or the federal government to resolve, whatever. All that being said, Meghann, I think her name is Meghann Rapinoe. She did say that. She said that, she thinks that trans women should be able to play with biological women, which I think it's dumb on the face of it. But the kneeling thing is interesting to me because they are on a national team. so it's not the same as if you're playing in the NFL and you're kneeling during the national anthem. When you're on a national team, you're representing America and probably should not be kneeling during the national anthem. However, that doesn't make me so happy that they lost. I don't like I think it's just weird, to be honest, like to take glee in someone else failing like that. And also, their losing had nothing to do with their wokeness. Like the case of Brittany Griner. Brittany Griner had taken a knee during the national anthem. She was speaking out against America. And then she goes to Russia, breaks their laws by having hash or weed on her. And the first thing she does when she's imprisoned is cries to the American government to get her out. That type of hypocrisy, I think, should be called out. But these women taking a knee, that might be their belief system. Doesn't mean it's right, but they can't be called hypocrites for it. And I just don't get the vitriol and hatred about it. Again, it's just sports. I mean, really.
I mean, but you mentioned something that I think is interesting. They're on a national team. They're not on the NFL. So they're representing a country which they're rejecting at that moment. And I found it ironic that Kaepernick would, who started this whole phenomenon, would go to a press conference with Che Guevara on his chest at some point. I mean, these people don't seem to understand the values they're rejecting, to take a moral pose, which is essentially what it is. I feel like they're sticking their fingers in the air and going with what's popular and what's loudest, the loudest voices. And in the meantime, rejecting all of the values that this country stands for, which people, whether they know them consciously or not, understand to some degree. And it's not just like yah patriotism that makes people feel like, oh, this is a thumb in the eye of America. It's a thumb in the eye of the values that represent America. Even if you can't articulate those, you understand them to be pretty damn good, pretty exceptional. What say you about this, Mort? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just going to ask, should there be national sports? I mean, in general, objectivists hold that the government should be there to protect individual rights. And I don't really see the relationship between protecting individual rights and national sports. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I agree with you. There should be no national sports. The whole idea is ridiculous.
Morgan, you have any thoughts about that? About any of the stuff we've said so far?
As to whether there should be national sports, that's an application. I've never thought about that before, but just thinking about it off the top of my head, I think Meghann and Michael are probably right. I can't actually immediately see a justification for a sports team being run by the government. It's a nice thing. I like watching World Cups. I like watching the Olympics, for example. And maybe you could come up with some way in which something like that could be done, in a way that's consistent with a kind of objectivist worldview. But yeah, I can't actually see the justification for a national sports team, which would save me from Go on, sorry.
You guys are globalists.
Probably. And then just remind me, what did you ask me, Mark? Sorry, it slipped my mind.
I actually have George Soros in the other room, just so you know.
The Sith Dark Lord himself. Well, I asked you, but what did I ask you at this point? I think I've forgotten. I'm the wrong person to do that to. I'm 58 years old, so some of that stuff just flies right out of my head. Well, in that vacuum of space, if you remember, Morgan, I have to deal with a few super chats here. Jonathan Honig for $2.99. Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to see you there, always on the chats. Catherine has been a member for 5 months. People don't understand what capitalism really is. Now, this is true. I quoted something recently on social media that Ludwig von Mises said about capitalism. That capitalism is a mentality. And I've always talked about capitalism in terms other than just the private ownership of the means of production, which is so dry. It's such a hard thing to pull over on people. But when you talk about a mentality and attitude towards life and a social system that protects rights and sovereignty, that to me raises the issue of capitalism to a moral level. Do you agree with that, Michael, or do you have something to add to that?
I do like the idea of coming up with better ways to communicate about capitalism. I think you're onto something. Mises's book, The Anti-Capitalist Mentality, was really good because he showed why people are opposed to it. So along those lines, I think as long as the way you're doing it is consistent with the idea of the private ownership of the means of production, I think it's great. I think that people that are advocating for capitalism, for liberty, by and large, do a horrible job of communicating it. That's just been my experience. And granted, now here's the thing: I haven't been around it a whole lot. Most of my imbibing of any viewpoints has been by means of literature. I haven't been listening to it, but in the brief time that I've been out in free society paying attention, I find that people communicating about liberty tend, and this is not a universal statement, but tend to not be very strong at doing so. It tends to be boring and dry and just doesn't exactly inspire somebody in the way that I think you're talking about. Whereas if you address somebody's mentality and the way you think, I think that is a good way to go.
Yeah, I actually tried to convince a Liberty channel on Twitter a few years ago that they needed to change their branding, because they would have professors talk about economics for 3-4 minutes at a time. And I was done within 30 seconds of it, even though I agreed with everything that they were saying. It was just not palatable. And I pitched a couple of ideas to them that they thought was off brand, and they wouldn't do it. And I don't see them on social media anymore. So they must have just flunked out. Meghann, you going to do a moonwalk for us? I noticed in the chat you're thinking about doing a moonwalk.
So I want to do it. I know we were talking about having better backgrounds. I thought I'd just like do it in the background while you guys are discussing serious subjects. And to be honest, I don't have a lot more to add about sports, so that's probably the best contribution I can make. But yes, I'm very happy to demonstrate how I walk and see if anyone can tell when I'm not talking that I'm an American. But
hey, I don't know that much about soccer as well, but you brought up probably one of the most interesting points of the whole discussion with sports, which was there shouldn't be national teams. I've never thought of it like Morgan. You've never thought of that. I have to think on that a bit. I mean, I think privately funded teams are great. And I thought these national teams were privately funded. I don't know, but certainly not at taxpayer expense. But if they're privately funded and they want to claim to represent America, I don't have an issue with that.
Oh, I'm with you. I don't know that they're taxpayer funded. I just assume they are. But if they're not and it's all private, I'm fine with it too.
Well, and Morgan brought up a good point too about if we want to extend that to its logical conclusion, I think we'd have to really examine whether the Olympics should be, have any state sponsorship. I don't see any reason why you couldn't have individuals and teams coming from different countries. And I mean, given that, I don't know. I mean, I don't see why you couldn't.
Well, I think this was an issue for many decades, that say the Soviet Union used to train and sponsor their athletes through government largesse, and that the Americans thought that gave them a peculiar advantage because, of course, the Americans were all sponsored by private entities, and so they thought the Soviet way was a lot more efficient and sort of cheating. So certainly that's something we should definitely avoid. Robert Nasir for $5. So this is with respect to the first topic that we were talking about. He says it's simple, the world's greatest argument, but it would have been worse if we hadn't intervened. That's with respect to the quote that you found so disturbing, Meghann, in that Guardian article, that they learned that government interference in the economy and in our lives actually works. And this is the argument they keep using over and over again. They use it with the vaccine. They use it with the shutdowns. Everything would be worse had they not. They're using it with climate change. It will be worse if we don't do something. It's a scary, open-ended, like super plastic way of looking at things. That you can bend the reality to meet whatever standard you want. Apollo Zeus with £2. Thank you, Apollo Zeus. Daniel Kraus. We already discussed that, Daniel. So I won't mention it. Apollo Zeus with another £5. No, not all of us are anti-American. He's European, Morgan, saying that not all. We know that there are individuals out there like you, pro-equality for £5, pro-American European here, who understand that Americans aren't the worst people on the planet, but potentially the best, at least with respect to our ideas. The final topic, if we want to even get to it, is a very interesting one about Spanish restaurants banning lone diners. So a couple of local lone diners have walked into their Barcelona restaurants trying to find a table, as they normally do, as I would here, if in Valencia, where I live, not Valencia, Spain, but Valencia, California. And they've been finding themselves kicked out of the establishments in favor of larger parties, foreigners, tourists, and they're getting offended by this. Now, I don't think this is a national policy. I don't think the government is imposing this on anyone. I think it's the restaurants themselves choosing to go for something a little more profitable than just the lone diner. I don't see anything wrong with that, even though it's probably hurting feelings. But if you guys can enlighten me as to another point of view, let me know. Michael, what say you?
I'm with you. I mean, I looked into it a little bit after reading the initial article, and it's private businesses basically are saying, look, if we let one person come in, he's occupying a whole table, and then we can't make money from groups of people. So they're there to make money. And I think that a lot of people anyway don't get the purpose of businesses is not to create jobs. It's not to give something to somebody else. It's not to give you a place to go. They're there to make money. Those other things now are obviously ancillary benefits. They need customers and they have to hire workers, and that's a good thing, but that's not the purpose of it. And if that's their model and they want to take a risk and think it's going to make them money, let them. At the same time, no one's forcing me or anyone else to go, so don't go, and maybe that'll force them to change their minds.
Or you know what? Takeout. Go takeout. Just order something.
Yeah, I'm
it
curious.
Out,
Is Uber Eats a thing in Spain?
It's certainly a thing in Paris, so I'm sure it's probably a thing in Spain too.
I'm a raging introvert, so I want to eat alone. I want nobody to talk to me. If it were possible to communicate with the servers without talking, I would be all for it.
I feel you. I love to go to a restaurant and read and sit there and eat my food. But look, apparently the tourism in Spain is raging. It's like the majority of the restaurant population are now tourists. So I completely understand that they'd want to go for that. Morgan, what say you? Does this disturb?
The food in Spain is delightful.
It's sick. It's great. I love it. I've only been to Barcelona and I forget the other place right off the coast of Tangier.
Madrid,
Malaga, a place right off the coast of Tangier. You take the ferry from Tangier right into that place. Whatever it's called, it was pretty awesome. Morgan, what say you?
Well, I mean, I would also describe myself as an introvert, but I don't know about you guys, but eating alone in a restaurant scares the hell out of me. Just the idea of doing that, something about it, and there's probably something psychologically wrong with it, but just intimidates me going in there saying, can I have a table for one? I don't want to do it. But as the more serious issue, I agree that it's the restaurant's right to do it. And as someone who works in the hospitality industry, I can certainly say that hospitality is probably one of the hardest hit industries by COVID and the aftermath of COVID. I'd have to say, probably maybe not the number one, but it's definitely up there. And they've got to make increasingly, not necessarily tough decisions, but they've got to make decisions that they wouldn't have made before COVID, about party sizes, about all these kinds of things. And for numerous reasons, they're making it. They've went through a long period of not making very much money. Prices have gone up. Quality of staff, certainly in the UK, has gone down in hospitality. It's really hard to find people who are actually worth hiring, and it's shocking the quality of service that you'll get at like a very good hotel. So I sympathize with them doing this, to be honest. The loan that they've got to run that restaurant isn't going to go away just because someone's upset that they can't have a table for one. And so they've got to take the bigger parties. And when that's an option for you, then that's what you got to do. So,
well, you know what? If they got that loan under Biden and they were students, then it would be forgiven. Unfortunately for them, that didn't happen. I'm sorry, Meghann, I cut you off. What were you going to say?
No, it's my fault. No, I was just going to say the one thing I found pretty strange about the article was that there was one local, because usually it's the locals who will stop by and have a meal by themselves, and it's the tourists who will come in groups. And this local was like, look, if it's a matter of money, what do I need to pay to just sit down and have a meal by myself? And they're like, it doesn't matter, you got to go. That I found really hard to explain. You know what I mean? Like, if she's willing to pay, a whole party's worth of money just to be by herself, which again, I applaud. I don't know what
but Meghann,
make of that.
Meghann, maybe she's just really weird, and maybe something's up with her specifically. And in that restaurant, they were like, we really don't want you here, you particularly. And that was just their way of kicking her out.
I guess I can't really argue with that.
Well, not only
I will-
that, but then what happens when the next person comes in and sees her sitting alone? Now they got to go through the whole thing again. And the person says, well, how come she can sit and I can't? And now they got to explain whatever.
Well,
It's
that's
the
true. Yeah, that's
restaurants.
true. Yeah, that's true. That does bring up that does open a can of worms that you don't necessarily want to open. Well, guys, as usual, I think we solved all the world's problems in a mere 54 minutes. Damn, objectivists are good at this shit. Anyway, before we head off, I have to tell you about some upcoming shows. 10 p.m. UK time, Cutting Edge with Lee Pearson, Bob Stubblefield, Steve Richens, and special guest Harry Binswanger on Mind Matters. So that will probably be a very interesting thing, guys. If you really like the content of the show, and you should, if you're sane, please like and subscribe. Please visit us every day, because this stuff is being churned out every day. And it's incredibly difficult to deal with current events on a philosophical level. You just don't hear it in a lot of other mediums. So please take advantage of this. I think objectivism is the lever that can really turn things around in the world today. We just got to popularize it. You just got to popularize it. And that's what we're doing. Any final parting words, folks, before we bid the objectivist and non-objectivist community tuning in adieu?
Just that I love that Archimedes reference. Give me a lever and a place to stand and I can move the world.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Well, folks, it's been great talking to you guys. It's always a pleasure. Everybody out there, tune into the next show, and always remember to check your premises. Peace.